You have heard it all. Subatomic particles, quarks, electrons, photons, quantum foam, strings, membranes, consciousness, energy, fields, mathematics, yada yada yada. All of which have been deeply studied and contemplated in an attempt to pin down the ultimate fabric of reality. What is it essentially made out of? What is the basic building block that constructs your overall experience of reality? We continue to smash elementary particles against each other with massive amounts of energy so that they crumble down into their smaller units. But is there an end to it? To go smaller, it requires more and more energy to split apart the particles, and it's impossible with our current instruments to view those particles with the naked eye. We can only observe fractions of data from a simulation on a computer screen. Now, of course, I should first emphasize that I'm not a scientist, so I might just talk bullshit on the scientific part. But anyway, these particles also have an extremely short lifespan, and the smaller you go, the shorter their lifespans get. And so it becomes extremely difficult to build hypersensitive instruments to track these ultra small units. So to come to my point, in order to have some knowledge about these building blocks, about anything really, we first have to perceive it in order to verify the existence of it. We have to detect it. We have to make a measurement. We need some form of data, just something that we can see, whether it be with our naked eye or an artificial instrument that translates some measurements onto a computer screen. Okay? So what does it mean to perceive something? What does an instrument detect? What does a sense organ detect? Well, I guess that in general, we can all assume that it has to do with detecting movement or vibration. In other words, a series of impulsive hits of energy. So a certain amount of something collides with a sense organ, and the sense organ is disturbed from its state of rest, and it translates this collision into a conscious experience. Or a detector would translate this collision into activity on a computer screen, or whatever digital medium that you could use to amplify the detected movement. So it seems very likely that everything that you can experience and can perceive is a form of movement, because your sense organs or a detector can only pick up impulsive hits of energy. If it weren't impulsive, it would be invisible for your sense organs. They would not be triggered and they would not send signals to your brain. So literally everything that we can possibly observe is only observable through the detection of impulses. And what is an impulse? It's a certain amount of something, because in reality we don't really know what we're looking at. We just name it we just name it something for the sake of communicating it. So it doesn't matter what the basic building block is, it will always be impulses. If we can detect it, if we can portray the detections onto a screen, it's gonna be movement. It's gonna be impulses. Without impulses, there is no detection, and it will remain invisible and non-existent for the observer. Now, what are we actually looking for? How do we define a basic building block? What does that mean? Do we define it as something that is indivisible, something that cannot be split apart into smaller pieces, something infinitely strong that cannot be destroyed into smaller particles, even when we use an infinite amount of energy trying to smash it apart? So I suppose that a basic building block is something that you cannot divide into smaller pieces, something utterly unbreakable, the very thing that cannot be created nor destroyed. So by definition, a thing that cannot be subdivided into smaller bits is basically not made out of smaller bits. So it's a singular thing that cannot be explored any deeper. It is just itself. It's made out of itself. Whatever it is. I mean, that's the logic, right? If it cannot be subdivided, then it is just itself. There is nothing to explain about it because you can't look deeper into it. Now, if everything in reality is fundamentally made out of this indivisible thing, including the vacuum, so all of space as well, then literally every cubic inch of the universe is entirely filled with this thing, such that they all connect and behave like a continuous field. Otherwise, I have a question for you. If you pick two of these indivisible building blocks, are they different or do they look exactly the same? Well, if they are different, then logically they must be comprised out of smaller bits, which shapes them into this particular contrast. if we're talking about the fundamental building block of reality, then all of these individual building blocks must look exactly the same, because if they were different, that would imply that they must have smaller subunits, which shapes them into a contrasting manifestation. So we're talking about a field which is infinitely filled with the exact same undividable building block, which means that within this field it is impossible to detect any contrast. It is completely free from contrasts, which leads me to my next point. It is just not possible to detect this field or this undividable building block precisely because there are no contrasts. So again, how do we detect information? Through movement and impulses that collides with a detector or a sense organ. But since the fundamental field is free from contrasts, I don't think it is able to move really. If this field is able to move, there are two options. Either the field as a whole is able to move, or a part within this field is able to move. If the field as a whole is able to move, then still we couldn't detect this movement because we are inside this field. We would have to go outside of this field, which means we would have to go outside of reality in order to be able to perceive its movement, but that's impossible. I can make an analogy with us standing on planet Earth. We don't notice that our planet is moving through space from the perspective on the surface of our planet. We could only notice it if we went outside the Earth, looking at the Earth from the perspective of another planet. But if a part of this field is able to move, then it would create a wave phenomenon. Just like water is a field, if something moves within the water, it propagates this movement into its surroundings, creating a wave formation. And basically a wave consists of two components, compression and expansion. A part of the wave is compressed and a part is stretched, or it expands. Now the question is it possible for the indivisible building block to be compressed? What does compression mean? Well, I guess in general it means that a group of particles with open space in between each one of them are getting forced to get closer and closer to each other, which means that the open space between them gets smaller and smaller. But since the indivisible building block is smaller than space itself because it is also the building block of space itself, it can't reduce anything within itself. It can't go smaller than itself because it is already the smallest thing possible, and therefore it's just impossible to compress it. Therefore a wave formation is not possible, and therefore it is unable to propagate movement. So my ultimate conclusion is that if there is such a thing as a fundamental building block of reality, it would be a thing that cannot move, that cannot create impulses, and therefore it cannot be detected by any sensitive instrument whatsoever. It will remain completely invisible for everything that has the ability to perceive or to detect. Now additionally, since it doesn't move, it is stationary. It doesn't change. It is something which is frozen in space and time forever. It's unperceivable, it's undetectable. Technology will always fail to come up with a device that can detect the basic building block of reality. So this thing, out of which everything is constructed, can never be translated into perceivable data or knowledge. Once again, trying to find an absolute answer leads us to impossible answers. Answers which are beyond everything we can fathom through our capacity to know and to think. Thanks for listening.